Once upon a time there was a girl, not in a faraway kingdom, in an ordinary five-story building on the edge of a city, where the smell of soup drifted from neighboring apartments and the stairwell was always damp, where father came home from the factory silent and heavy as stone, sat down for dinner, stared at his plate, and the girl sat across from him, small, quiet, and waited for him to look up, to smile, to say something, anything. He never did. Mother was different. Mother was always there. But she too looked not at the girl but at father. Read his moods, gave him the best piece of meat, spoke quieter when he frowned. The girl watched and learned a lesson nobody meant to teach her. A woman exists to please. Love means enduring. The most important thing is not to be left alone. She was 7 years old. She remembered it for the rest of her life. Once, she was around 9, she did something wrong. She can't remember what exactly. Broke a plate, perhaps, got a bad grade, or simply got in the way at the wrong moment. Father looked at her and turned away. 2 weeks. 2 weeks in a small apartment, as if she didn't exist. Father looked through her. Mother said nothing, and the girl understood something very important. Silence is punishment. Being invisible is the most terrible thing there is. Any pain is better than loneliness. She remembered that lesson too, forever. Years passed. The girl grew up, became a nurse. Every day, white uniform, other people's pain, tired feet. She knew how to care for others, that she did well. For herself, less so. She barely noticed herself at all. Daniel. She was 20 when she met Daniel. He was handsome, confident, gave compliments easily, like handing out change. Eva bloomed. For the first time in her life, as though someone was looking at her. Really looking, or so it seemed. They moved in together. And then a different Daniel appeared, the one who came home and stared at his phone, who answered in single words, who fell asleep, turned away. Eva tried harder. Cooked his favorite meals, wore pretty dresses, asked how his day went. He said, "Fine," and back to his phone. She thought, maybe I'm not trying hard enough. She tried harder. One day she came home early. The door was unlocked. In the hallway, unfamiliar shoes, small, red. She stopped outside the bedroom door and heard a voice, a familiar voice, her friend Katya's voice. Eva didn't scream, didn't cry. She quietly picked up her bag, walked out to the street, sat on a bench outside the building, and thought a strange thought. I'm not surprised, because somewhere deep inside, she had known, had seen the signs, the phone he took to the bathroom, the business trips that never existed before, the way his eyes slid past her. She had seen it and not seen it, because seeing meant being left alone. And alone was the most terrifying thing there was. Thomas appeared a year later, quiet, serious, solid. Now here is a reliable man, Eva decided. At first it seemed that way, but then Thomas began to go silent. Not like father, indifferently, differently. Thomas went silent, and in his silence there was something cold, sharp, as if he was punishing her. For what? She didn't always understand. One evening she came home from work and said she was tired. He looked at her and said quietly, very quietly, "You never stop complaining." She went silent, apologized for being tired. Then it got worse. First he grabbed her arm too hard, then pushed her, then hit her once, then again. And every time he cried afterward, said he hadn't meant to, that it wouldn't happen again, that she drove him to it. And Eva, who had known since childhood that silence was punishment, said nothing and stayed, because alone was more frightening. She left after he raised his hand in front of a neighbor. The neighbor called the police. Eva stood on the landing in her housecoat and thought, I needed a neighbor to leave. I couldn't do it myself. That was more frightening than the blow. Marcus. Marcus was different, completely different. Beautiful restaurants, expensive flowers, weekend getaways. For the first time Eva felt like the heroine of a film. He said, "You deserve better." And she believed him. Didn't notice the small things, that he never paid himself, always forgot his wallet, that his friends looked at her with something like pity, that he borrowed money from her colleagues, from her mother, just temporarily. "I'll pay it back." One day, he didn't come home. Phone switched off. A week later, she heard from his friend Marcus had left for another city, with the debts and with another woman. Eva sat in their, now only her, apartment, counted the debts, and thought, I saw it. I saw all of it, and I stayed anyway. 5 years later, for 5 years she was alone, for the first time in her life, truly alone, not because she couldn't find someone, but because she finally decided to understand. Why? Why the same thing every time? Why she saw and didn't see? Why the fear of being alone was stronger than the fear of pain? She went to therapy. For a long time it was hard. She cried during sessions, got angry. One day, she said to her therapist, "I hate my parents." The therapist answered calmly, "That's understandable. What do you feel toward the little girl who sat across from her father and waited?" Eva went quiet and cried, not from anger, from compassion, for herself, for that little girl in the 5-story building who wanted so much to be seen. She understood something important. All 3 men had been different, but she had chosen them by one principle. They reminded her of father, Daniel, just as distant and unreachable, Thomas, just as silent and cold, Marcus, just as elusive and impossible to hold. She hadn't been looking for love. She had been looking for the familiar. And the familiar was pain. And she understood something else about fear. The fear of loneliness was not her fear. It was her mother's fear. Mother was afraid of being left alone and endured, and taught her daughter that enduring is what love looks like. Artyom. His name was Artyom. They met at the hospital. He was in a ward with a broken arm, had fallen off his bicycle. He smiled sheepishly, telling her, a grown man fell off a bicycle. Eva was changing his dressing. He wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at her, asked her name, asked if she liked her work, listened to the answer, really listened. When she was leaving, he said, "Eva, may I invite you for coffee? If you don't like me, at least you'll have the memory of a good cup." She laughed. For the first time in a long time, laughed freely, without calculation, without fear. Later, she told him she had thought for a long time before agreeing. He asked why. She said honestly, "I was scared. I have a difficult history with men." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "So do I in some ways, but I think the past is where we came from, not where we're going." She thought, this man knows how to talk. It was so unfamiliar that she almost got frightened. The moral Eva thought about this afterward, for a long time, about why she hadn't seen it before, and here is what she understood. She had seen it. She always saw it. Daniel had been dismissive from the very first weeks. Thomas had been cruel from the start, just quietly. Marcus had never once paid for coffee on a first date. The signs were there, they were always there, but the fear of loneliness was louder. Louder than the signs, louder than intuition, louder than common sense. The fear of loneliness is not weakness. It is a lesson we were taught in childhood, when instead of a hug, silence, when instead of a conversation, 2 weeks of emptiness. When a child understands being invisible is worse than any pain, and grows into an adult who chooses pain just to avoid invisibility. But here is what matters. That lesson can be unlearned. It takes time. It is painful. But it can be done, and when you unlearn it, you suddenly begin to see people differently. Not through the eyes of fear, but through the eyes of calm. And then, a man who says, "If you don't like me, at least you'll have the memory of a good cup of coffee," doesn't frighten you with his kindness. He simply makes you smile? Did you recognize yourself in Eva's story? Was there a moment in your life when you saw, but didn't want to see? Write in the comments. There are many people here carrying the same story. See you in the next tale.